Okay, welcome everyone and good afternoon. My name is Dantel Proctor from the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. Welcome to today's session, Homeless Education 101, a primer on supporting the education of children and youth experiencing homelessness. Please allow me to share some brief details about the session. Today's presenter is Christina Dukes. Christina is a federal liaison for the SERVE Center in the National Center for Homeless Education, where she provides face-to-face and online training and technical assistance to state coordinators in homeless education. Today's session will last for approximately 45 minutes and is being recorded. We'd like to encourage everyone to utilize the chat function at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to submit questions or comments for our presenters. Please be sure to select everyone from the drop-down box to ensure that your comments and questions are seen by me and our speakers. You may submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we will leave time at the end to address them, to address as many questions as possible. If we do not have time to get through all of the questions, we will reply to all participants by email within the next 5 to 7 business days. All participants have been placed on mute to avoid background noise. Please do not unmute yourself. Instead, refer to the chat function on the right side of the screen if you have a question or comment. Following the Q&A portion of our session, there will be a brief poll. Your participation in these polls is extremely important to helping us better prepare our presentations and ensure that we are delivering content to you in a way that best suits your needs. We greatly appreciate your feedback to these questions. Before I hand the session over to Christina, I would like to remind folks of the upcoming webinars that will be held in November. More information and the link to register for these is included on the last slide of this presentation. Also, I would like to share with you the mission of the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. Christina, I hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Dantel, and welcome everyone to today's session. As Dantel mentioned, we're going to be looking at the issue of homeless education, and in particular, the first part of the session today will be sort of an overview of the field of homeless education, who are the people involved, a little bit about our program, and the supports that are available to children and youth experiencing homelessness. And then the second half of the presentation will focus specifically on the issue of chronic absence among homeless students. And towards the end of my slides, you'll see that NCEE recently released a brief specifically on this topic, and many of the points that you see in today's presentation are included in that brief. So if you want sort of a printable handout, so to speak, or resource for more information, please do check out our brief. A little bit more about NCEE. We are the U.S. Department of Education's Technical Assistance Center for the Federal Education for Homeless Children and Youth, or EHCY program. And as you can see on the slide, we provide a number of resources and supports to the field for people working with children and youth and families experiencing homelessness. So please visit our website. We invite you to call or email our helpline if you have homeless education related questions. You can download or order in hard copy some of our products, join us for a webinar, join our listserv for periodic announcements, or of course, follow or like us on social media. So let's look first at the overall field of homeless education, the program, the people, and the supports that are available to students experiencing homelessness. So a little bit about the EHCY program. We are authorized under Subtitle 7B of the McKinneyVento Homeless Assistance Act, but we were most recently reauthorized or amended by Title IX Part A of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So the McKinneyVento Act is a broader federal law that provides a variety of supports and services for people experiencing homelessness, but that little education subtitle, Subtitle 7B, focuses specifically on education for children and youth experiencing homelessness, and so whenever we're reauthorized, it happens whenever the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is reauthorized. Under the law, every state must appoint a state coordinator for homeless education, and that will be out of your State Department of Education. That person will be out of the State Department. And then every district must appoint a local homeless education liaison. Now, if you don't know who your state coordinator is or your local liaison, we invite you to visit our state resources webpage. Click on your state and you'll see the state coordinator's contact information and a link to local liaison contact information. In terms of the funding, so each year states receive annual EHCY allocations, and they are proportional to the state's Title I Part A allocation. Each state will retain a portion of its funds, its allocation, to conduct state-level activities. For most states, they're allowed to retain up to 25% of their EHCY allocation. And then they'll distribute the remainder of their EHCY funds to districts through a competitive subgrant process. Now, what that means is that not every school district receives dedicated McKinney-Vento funding. In fact, only around 20% of school districts receive that dedicated funding. And yet, all school districts across the country are required by federal law to comply with the McKinney-Vento Act. For those of you who maybe are new to the issue of homeless education, or you don't have a lot of experience working with children and youth experiencing homelessness, you may wonder, do we really need a specific program or a specific law? And so we wanted to provide you with some context that students experiencing homelessness really do face some unique and acute challenges and barriers when it comes to accessing education. So students experiencing homelessness have higher rates of special education needs, mental and physical health issues, school absenteeism, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation, grade retention, and dropping out of high school. And they do, as I mentioned, face unique challenges and barriers. And we'll talk about some of those. For instance, lacking documentation that often is required for enrollment. And then also ensuring that these children and youth have access to education and supports for school success can play a really key role for them in making sure that as they move into adulthood, they're prepared for financial stability and also to break the cycle of poverty and homelessness. So who exactly is homeless? Well, our statute includes a definition of homelessness, and I will say it may be a little bit broader than common conceptions of what homelessness looks like. But this definition, which is the definition that is used by U.S. public schools, really is a true representation of where families and youth experiencing homelessness seek shelter when they lose housing. So the McKinney-Vento Act defines homeless children and youth as individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And that's the general guiding phrase of our definition of homeless. And then the definition continues and provides a number of types of living arrangements that do qualify as homeless because they're not fixed, regular, and adequate. The first is what is often called informally doubling up. But the actual legislative wording is sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. Around 75% of the children and youth who were identified as homeless during the 15-16 school year do fall under this category. And then also children and youth living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds due to the lack of alternative adequate accommodations. Now, before we continue on the definition, I'll mention that under our statute, it's the local liaison who has both the authority and the responsibility of determining eligibility. So as we're going through this definition, you don't need to feel like you have to be an expert on all the nuances and ins and outs, but if you can just get a general concept, it'll help you know if you're working with a student, hey, this student might be McKinney-Vento eligible. Let me reach out to the local liaison to make a referral. All right, continuing with the definition, living in emergency or transitional shelters, living in a public or private place where people are not supposed to sleep. And that would include cars, parks, public spaces, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, transit stations, or similar settings. And then finally, migrant children, not as a whole or categorically, but if they're living in the circumstances described in the definition. A couple of other important pieces. So our program also serves unaccompanied youth, and these are children or youth whose living arrangement meets the definition of homeless, but who is also not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. A more informal way to say that is, this is a student who's experiencing homelessness on his or her own, not under the care of a parent or guardian. Also, prior to ESSA, the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless did include the phrase awaiting foster care placement, but this was removed by ESSA in December 2016, with the exception of a handful of covered states, Arkansas, Delaware, Maryland, and Nevada, and in those states, you will remove awaiting foster care placement from your definition on December 10th of this year. But also noteworthy is that under ESSA, all children in any stage of child welfare involvement are eligible for new school stability supports that are included under Title I Part A of the statute. So they're not exactly like McKinney-Vento protections, but they're very, very similar, including school of origin rights. For those of you who, again, you may be new to this definition and you're like, really? Doubled up? Or, you know, really? Motels? And so, yes, and the reason is that shelters, right, when people often think of, okay, who's homeless? They think of people staying in homeless shelters or maybe staying in public spaces or in unsheltered locations like a car, a park, you know, on the streets. And that is a form of homelessness. But for families and youth, it often is more complicated than that. So first of all, shelters often, quite simply, are just not an option. A lot of communities don't have homeless shelters. They're usually concentrated in population centers, so urban areas or maybe suburban areas. And that means that a lot of communities simply don't have that safety net. Or if they do have a shelter, a lot of times they're full. So what we see is that many times shelters must turn away people who are seeking assistance because they simply don't have the capacity to serve them. Also, shelters do have stay limits. So if a family is able to get into a shelter, they may only be able to stay for 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days. And depending on the circumstances that cause their homelessness, the issue may not be resolved in time. And so they're back into that cycle of looking for a place to stay and bouncing around. And finally, families and youth may hesitate to enter the shelter system. They may have concerns about safety and privacy. So what we see is a lot of times families or youth will look for any other alternative of where can I stay because we've just lost our housing. So where can I go? Can I stay with the neighbor? Can I stay with a relative? Can we scrape together the money? Maybe I don't have first, last, and security and utilities deposits, but maybe I can scrape together enough from a side job to get us into a low-cost motel. And yet a lot of times those arrangements simply don't last. Families or youth who end up staying with a neighbor many times are asked to leave because people aren't prepared to take responsibility long-term for another family or youth. And the presence of another family or a youth can change household dynamics. It can lead to overcrowding, different sleeping arrangements. And so what we see is that a lot of times those arrangements simply don't last. In terms of causes of homelessness, largely, especially for families, homelessness is a financial issue. Many communities lack affordable housing. Parents may struggle with making enough money to afford the cost of living in their area, so low-paying jobs, or a single parent or single income household. So if anything happens to the ability of that wage earner to bring home the check, right, that can really destabilize a family. Or disabilities that may affect a breadwinner's ability to work. For youth, a lot of times family conflict or even abuse or violence can bring about a separation between a youth and his or her parents. And then finally, I remember seeing a video, an awareness video once, that showed two women. They were adult women who they were LGBT, they identified as lesbian, and one of them sort of spoke to what a turbulent period of time it was in her life after she revealed that to people she loved, but she had enough support around her that as she went through that turbulent time and maybe broken relationships, she was able to, through a broader social network, find stability. But maybe for a youth or a family who, for whatever the reason, loses housing, such as the case of the other woman in the video, if they don't have a network of support that has the resources to take them in and support them during their crisis, they may end up homeless. And so, to summarize that point, many families or youth who end up homeless just have either no network of support to help them when they fall on hard times, or an under-resourced network of support. Let's talk about the rights of McKinney-Vento students, and we could do an entire webinar just on these two slides. So we'll keep it high level, knowing that you can ask questions as needed. So McKinney-Vento students have the right to, well, actually the statute, I should say, requires school districts to remove barriers to full school participation for McKinney-Vento students. And that could be barriers related to fees, fines, absences, and really any number of other issues. McKinney-Vento students are required or are entitled to immediate school enrollment, even if they're lacking documentation that is normally required. So proof of residence, proof of guardianship, previous school records, and even if they missed application or enrollment deadlines during any period of homelessness. McKinney-Vento students have the right to school stability or school selection, which means that they can either continue, if they become homeless and move around, they can continue attending the same school, their school of origin, or they can enroll immediately in the local school near where they're staying. Now, there is an individualized student best interest determination in terms of school selection, but the statutory wording actually sort of tips the scale by saying that school districts should presume that continuing to attend the school of origin is in a student's best interest, unless this is not what the parent, guardian, or unaccompanied youth wants. If it's deemed to be best for a student to stay in the school of origin, the district must provide transportation to and from the school of origin. And also new under ESSA, school districts must provide homeless youth with assistance for receiving partial or full credit for coursework that they completed satisfactorily at a previous school. And the point of this is that what can happen sometimes to youth experiencing homelessness through no fault of their own is that as they move around, if they're moving schools, the new school may not, or again, prior to ESSA, would not have known what to do. Hey, can we give them credit if they only did part of the coursework, part of the course at the previous school, or what if their coursework is a little different than ours? And so what ESSA does is requires school districts to grant partial or full credit if the students completed the coursework satisfactorily at the previous school. We see some new language under ESSA regarding local liaisons and school counselors assisting youth experiencing homelessness with preparing for and transitioning to college. Also, homeless youth are entitled to free school meals, and they don't have to fill out the normal household application or prove income. Once the local liaison has identified a student for McKinney-Vento services, they are automatically eligible through a streamlined certification process. Also, homeless children and youth are categorically eligible for Title I support, and that can include receiving support through what's called the district's homeless set-aside, which is a setting aside of funds, of Title I Part A funds at the district level that can be used to support homeless students, including funding the local liaison position or funding transportation to the school of origin. And then also for McKinneyVento students with special education needs, there are some particular provisions under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that ensures continuity of services and comparable services even as a student may be moving between school districts or states. All right, so we're not going to do a formal poll, but I want you to just kind of maybe jot down your answers or note them mentally. So which of the following statements are true? Select all that apply. Students experiencing homelessness can attend any school in the district where they are living. Students experiencing homelessness don't have to fill out a household meal application to get free school meals. Unaccompanied youth don't have to include parent information on their FAFSA, or none of the above. So have a moment, think about that, and in just a second I'll show you the correct response. All right, so, and I'm realizing I didn't go into a lot of detail about that FAFSA piece. So students experiencing homelessness don't have the right to attend any school in the district where they're living, just the local school or the school of origin, and the statute actually provides definition for those terms. And it is true, though, that students experiencing homelessness don't have to fill out the meals application to get free school meals. And unaccompanied youth, which, again, those are youth living in homeless situations, so their living arrangement meets the definition of homeless, but they're on their own. And they do qualify as independent students when they fill out the FAFSA, which means they don't have to include parent information. And their aid package, their federal aid package for college, is based only on the student's income and assets. So that was basically a blitz of the field of homeless education. So I'll pause for a moment and turn it over to Dontel, who's going to share any questions you've typed in.
Hi. Somebody did ask, how can you tell if a student is actually homeless? And they said that, excuse me, they said that they've run into cases where people use other people's addresses to register their children for school.
Right. So first of all, there are certain things. The school district has the responsibility of identifying homeless children and youth. And some strategies that school districts will use is, number one, they may use an enrollment questionnaire as part of the, a housing questionnaire as part of the enrollment packet, which will screen for possible eligibility. And then if there is any sort of gray, usually the local liaison or other personnel trained by the local liaison will follow up with the family or youth just to say, hey, I have a few questions. I wanted to see what supports your child may be eligible for. May I ask you just a few questions? And so they'll ask a few questions to see to get a good understanding of the family's circumstances. Now, for a couple of other things. School districts are required to post publicly information about the rights of homeless children and youth, and so families or youth may see that information in school or in the community, and so we'll contact the local liaison. So usually there's sort of a discussion and confirmation process that happens, but it would not be appropriate. A student who uses another family's address would not be deemed McKinneyVento eligible.
Thank you. And another question came in. They asked, how about natural disasters and wildfires? Unfortunately, I'm not sure what that was referring to, though.
I saw that question pop up. I think that was asking about when would a family or youth who lost their housing to natural disaster or wildfires be considered eligible? And I'll just take us back very quickly. So the short answer is possibly, depending on the circumstances. So natural disasters are not specifically named in the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless, and yet families and youth who are displaced or lose housing because of a natural disaster could be considered McKinney-Vento eligible. And really, it's going to depend on where does the family land, right? If they're able to secure fixed, regular, and adequate housing, right? So it may depend on the resources that the family has. If a family has lost housing and they don't have the resources to go to another place that would be considered fixed, regular, and adequate, instead maybe they end up doubling up temporarily until they can get back on their feet, or staying in a low-cost motel, they would be considered McKinney-Vento eligible. So it's really about where did they land if they lost their housing.
And then the last question that came in says, in rural locations, what if you can't find an acceptable transportation method to keep a student in their school of origin?
Well, the short answer, and this is not, my thinking, this is the authority of statute as passed into law by Congress, there really is no option for a school district to say, we can't do it, right? I do think it can be more challenging in rural areas. We actually put out a publication specifically related to meeting school of origin transportation requirements in rural areas, and so there are some creative methods that we suggest in there. And so if you're interested in more information, you can email me and I'll send you that publication. But admittedly, it can be more challenging in rural areas, but there's really no way for a school to just be like, you know what, we can't do it.
Great. We have another question that came in. It says, what if a family's home is flooded, but insurance is putting them up in another home while repairs are made?
Right. So, probably they would not be McKinney-Vento eligible, because the reality is that the McKinney-Vento Act is a pretty small program, and it's not, I don't think it's really intended or equipped to mitigate every tough circumstance or even every circumstance of residential mobility. But having said that, a lot of times some of those gray cases, you've got to ask additional questions like, how long is the family expected to be there? Is this just a week and they'll be back in their home, or is this expected to be sort of a long-term thing? So I would want to know a little bit more information. And yeah, and of course also remember that you'll want to speak with your local liaison, because your local liaison is going to have the ultimate sort of determination on that. I'm noticing, Dontel, we probably should keep going in the interest of time, or did we have a number of other questions you think we need to take now?
That was actually the last question.
All right, perfect. So we'll keep going, and then we'll have one other Q&A at the end of the session. I do want to say, though, I appreciate your questions. It lets me know you're engaged, and so I just want to make sure I don't completely miss out on time to cover this second section here, but we'll stop again for questions. So sort of in homage, if you will, to the fact that I know the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center does quite a bit of work on the issue of chronic absence, I did want to take part of our time together today to focus on this issue among students experiencing homelessness. So just so we're all on the same page, chronic absence is when a student misses 10% or more of the school year for any reason, whether it's excused or unexcused. So it's not the same thing as truancy, it's missing school for any reason. And again, this is pulling from the research that we did and sort of the research that's out there in the field that informed our chronic absence brief at NCHE. But some of the top reasons for, or the top causes of chronic absence are physical and mental health issues, housing instability, competing responsibilities, and misconceptions about the importance of attendance. And homeless students could struggle really with all of these issues. So homeless children and youth, just by virtue of being low income, a lot of times don't have great or consistent access to health care. And so they may be sicker more often, or dealing with asthma but not be able to get proper treatment, or even have dental issues that would cause them to miss school. And then housing instability, as a family or youth is kind of bouncing around, especially a family who's homeless and is trying to find a place to stay, that can easily bleed into a student missing school. And then for competing responsibilities, this can come into play for instance, youth, unaccompanied homeless youth who are pretty much on their own, maybe couch surfing, staying somewhere, trying to get a job, trying to become self-sufficient, and so they're working but trying to go to school, and sometimes other life responsibilities win out. And sometimes parents may just not know. When your child misses school, they really can be set back, and so make sure that you're making every effort to have them in school every day. Now, it's not a complete surprise, given the multiple challenges that homeless children and youth deal with, that students experiencing homelessness are chronically absent at a rate that is at least double that of the overall student population. And this comes from research from a variety of sources, so out of the state of Utah, New York City, and several other sources, which again are cited in our chronic absence brief. But interestingly, in terms of how a state or district may look at this issue and consider how to respond or structure interventions, data from the Florida Department of Education indicate that chronic absence may be concentrated in a subset of schools, with 50% of all chronically absent students in Florida being concentrated in only 15% of schools. And so by using data, states can really zero in, okay, where is this the biggest issue? Because maybe that's where we really need to target our efforts. This comes from data from the New York City Department of Education, or public school district, I guess I should say. Chronically absent elementary students experiencing homelessness repeated the same grade at over 3 times the rate of students experiencing homelessness who missed fewer than 5 days of school. So what we see is that while experiencing homelessness in and of itself is a risk factor for how a student does in school, our homeless students who attend school regularly fare much better than homeless students who are chronically absent. Now, interestingly, and this was as I was researching for the brief, I thought, okay, we know there's a clear benefit for students. What about for school districts? And attendance, as you guys may know, affects funding for school districts. And so, and the citations for these little bits of information are included in the brief that I mentioned, but by re-engaging 51 chronically absent students, a Colorado school district increased its funding by $350,000 because, as you know, schools are paid based on attendance and when schools are present, or excuse me, students are present in their seats. By contrast, and this was a news article out of the San Diego area, during the 2009-2010 school year, public schools in San Diego County forfeited over $102 million in state funding due to student absences. And so, in addition to all the reasons that it's the right thing to do for student outcomes and for the well-being and school performance of students, to do everything possible to get kids in school every day, there's also a financial incentive for school districts to make sure that students are attending regularly. So what can schools do to support regular attendance? And some of what you're going to see may be similar to what you've heard on other presentations on this topic, but just to recap, looking at data is so important, right? So for instance, in the case of Florida, where they know that a large concentration of chronic absence is concentrated in a relatively small number of schools, that's going to let them know, hey, if we want to start offering particular interventions, we know where we need to target them because we know where the issue is biggest. Same thing on maybe a more student, an individual student level. Like if you know that children and youth who are in foster care or children and youth who are experiencing homelessness, they're really struggling to be in school every day. We're going to use our data and know where to target interventions and when to intervene. So if you're looking at when are we seeing a student start to miss school, you need to intervene early, but you're only going to be able to do that if you're tracking and knowing who's missing school. Also, there are lots of ideas, and we detail ideas at a greater degree in our brief. So if you want to take a deep dive, again, please check out our brief. But there are lots of student-level interventions that districts are using to promote regular school attendance. And that includes working with students and families through mentoring or prompt follow-up once a pattern of absence is noticed. Offering before and after programming that may draw students to be in school. Incentivizing school attendance, like I don't know if I have a particular idea, but I know as I was reading some of the very creative things that school districts do, it can be prizes, it can be a dance, it can be any number of things that schools are doing that are going to make kids want to be in school every day so that they can be rewarded for that. Also for our low-income families who maybe don't have access to regular health care, providing school-based dental and health services is a way to help students be healthier and hopefully be in school then more regularly instead of missing school for untreated health issues. And also schools should be considering, do we have policies that maybe inadvertently decrease student attendance? For instance, might there be a time when instead of for excessive absences or tardiness, instead of out of school suspension, I guess depending on the level, maybe in school suspension or some other kind of discipline that keeps the student in school and engaged rather than sort of maybe shooting the school in its foot, right? Like, okay, we have a student who's not attending school, so because of that as a discipline, we're going to keep them out of school, and that's probably not going to do well for the student or the district. So if there's any other way to address that issue through a policy change or a practice change, that might be a good next step. Also, consider leveraging community support through partnerships, so partnering with homeless shelters, partnering with social services, or even local public transit and media. I remember learning some of the things that New York City Public Schools does to encourage school attendance. They have celebrities who are willing to kind of join with the schools, like I remember Whoopi Goldberg and a couple of major NBA stars who recorded messages that it's sort of like a robocall, right? But the school district calls the family or the student, and there it is, a celebrity on the line being like, hey, we miss you at school, come back to school, and or signs on public transit that talk about the importance of having your children be in school every day. And then finally, and this is what I would say is especially particular to the field of homeless education, some of the McKinney-Vento Act's requirements are aimed at regular school attendance and school stability, right? So instead of a student having to move through schools and dealing with all that disruption, they can stay in the same school and continue attending uninterrupted, even if they lose housing and move to a different area. They have transportation to the school of origin to make sure they're there every day. Things like that. Free school meals, right? So to draw kids to school to make sure that they can have regular meals. And then also, as of the 16-17 school year, school districts are required to collect and report data on chronic absence among students experiencing homelessness. So within a couple of years, we're going to see a national level data set from the Department of Education on this issue, which we're imagining will bring greater attention to it, right? So if it's not measured, it's not paid attention to, but now we're going to see it measured, and we're thinking it will bring about greater attention to this issue. So that's it for our slides. I'm going to turn it back to Dantel for any remaining questions you may have.
Okay, now we move on to answering some of your questions that were submitted during the presentation. Everyone should feel free to continue to submit their questions using the chat session or the chat feature during this time. I'll also remind everyone to please remain online following the Q&A session to take part in our feedback poll. Your participation in this process is extremely important to our future events. And we do have one question so far, Christina. Someone asked, some families live in transitional housing for 2 to 3 years. Is there a point where this living arrangement isn't considered homeless anymore?
So this actually is a pretty clear issue. The Department of Education has said that transitional housing, which usually lasts 12 to 24 months, does meet the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless. And so while they're in that transitional housing, they would be considered homeless. The only thing that I would say is a lot of times school districts conflate eligibility with the issue of school selection. So, for instance, if it's known that a family has lost housing and is now in transitional housing and they're expected to be there for a period of time, or maybe they've already been there for a year and they're expected to remain, at the beginning of a school year, a school district could talk with the family and say, hey, would it make more sense at this time for your child to go ahead and enroll in the local school? Let's talk about what may be in the child's best interest at this time. So eligibility is a separate decision and the first decision that needs to be made, which then would be followed by school selection. But the short answer is as long as the child is in transitional housing, they would be McKinney-Vento eligible.
Great, thank you, Christina. We haven't had any more questions come in just yet.
Well, I'll go ahead and do one more quick slide to provide additional information. There's the link. You can download our In School Every Day Addressing Chronic Absenteeism Among Students Experiencing Homelessness. That's a new brief that we just released about a month ago. Or really you can check out any of our other briefs. We have briefs on transportation, immediate enrollment, the role of the local liaison, all different types of topics related to homeless education. So please do check those out. And I guess with that, back to you, Dantel, either for more questions or if you're ready to close us out.
There are no more questions. So if it's okay with you, Christina, we can move on to the polling.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so at this time, we'd like to encourage everyone to participate in a few quick polling questions related to this session. Your responses are completely anonymous, so please answer honestly and help us find ways to improve our approach and content offerings in the future. We sincerely appreciate your feedback. So you should see that on the screen, on the right side of your screen now.
Also, just so you guys know, I'm not seeing your feedback, so feel free to be completely honest. So just wanted people to know that.